Thanks for staying with us. This is Daybreak, and we appreciate your company. Let's begin with a look at the front pages of the publications. And with me in studio this morning is the Uriri constituency representative at the National Assembly, Mark Nyamita, on my far right. Good morning.
Good morning, Ayub.
Lovely having you here on the broadcast.
Thank you.
Javas Bigambo is a political and governance commentator. Good morning, Javas.
Good morning, Ayub, and I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you also.
Great.
And Kidi Mwaga is a lawyer and convener of the Interparties Youth Forum. Good morning, Kidi.
Good morning, Ayub.
And gentlemen, let's begin with this latest development from Washington. And the U.S. Senate and the chairperson for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has faulted the president in May for his dalliance with China and Kenya's involvement in Sudan regarding its support for the RSF in Sudan, which is the Rapid Support Forces. But what also is embodied in that is in the face of the criticism and a review of the country's non-NATO ally status, which was conferred in 2024. There are criticisms of abductions of Turkish nationals, for example, Mustafa Jeng, Abdullahi Jeng, Hussein Yesilsu, Necdet Seyitolu, Ozduk Uzun, and the others who reportedly were taken from Kenya by intelligence officers from Ankara, as well as the deaths of Kenyans, including Mwalimu Albert Ojwang and the others who were killed by police brutally, including the mask vendor Boniface Kariuki and the others documented by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, which indicated that more than 1,400 people have been apprehended in relation to the protest in 2024 and 5, with nearly 100 abductions. Some of the abducted individuals are still missing, according to their relatives, as per the report issued by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. First to you, Javas, it seems the echoes of our domestic issues are subject of international conversations, including amongst the community of nations. Now, a very strategic ally is considering looking into this.
Well, Ayub, you see, Kenya is a critical member of the Committee of Nations. And when it comes to matters relations, it is always the determination of a nation state to reflect and decide on what kind of allies to have, what kind of allies to determine as close, and others that may be peripheral. Now, the issue here, for instance, on the US reconsidering Kenya's status as a major non-NATO ally, it is a conferment that is barely a year old or thereabout. And it's not that it is not significant. It is a very significant kind of relation, because I would say it was upgraded, though Kenya has never depended on that kind of status. As a matter of fact, it also speaks to us as a nation that to what extent should we always reflect on our affairs, what we do, because whatever steps we take are always consequential. But also let us not engage in the cross-national politics of bigotry. Various countries that are looking at Kenya with frowning faces, some of them have engaged in human rights violations. In fact, some of them engaged in atrocious acts that demean human rights all over the world. And so I would say that reflecting on the possibility and the decision of the US Senate and potentially Congress to review its relations with Kenya, Kenya remains a critical a nation state in this region and even to the Horn of Africa. It will remain a critical ally of the United States of America. And as a matter of fact, yes, the issue of how we relate with our neighbors, including Sudan and South Sudan, is crucial. But as a matter of fact, it must not come out as an indictment as though Kenya has or is engaged in activities that are overtly demeaning to the sovereign powers and sovereign status of Sudan.
Yeah, and the military, led by Al-Burhan, have been very categorical about what they said was blatant interference in the affairs of Sudan by the Kenyan government, and therefore a violation of their sovereignty. In that regard, though, how then do you treat the complaints registered in that respect?
I think it is proper for Sudan and the leadership to express such kind of disenchantment or being chagrined with perceived interference, which interference has actually not been corroborated. Because if we were to look at the official records, a statement that was issued by the Prime Cabinet Secretary and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Honorable Musalia Mudavadi, was categorical that Kenya has not interfered and is not desirous of interfering with the internal affairs of the Sudan. However, Kenya has got relations and will continue to relate with the Sudan as a nation, as an ally state, whether their issues are resolved as presently and resolved as presently are, or even in the distant future when it will be a more prosperous and peaceful nation.
Okay, and Kidi Mwagag, the voices and the calls for justice have been mounting, amplified by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and it seems there was at some point a slow response regarding the calls for justice. Yes. How does this amplify and the specificity around the investigations into abductions and the extrajudicial killings of Kenyans, torture of civilians, and this includes at the heart of what now the American Congress will review as part of generally the approach towards our relations with China, Russia, and Iran.
On 23rd of June, while meeting young people at Fungamano under the Interparties Youth Forum, particularly young aspirants then, a few days to the anniversary of 25th June, actually 2 days, we made a plea to Kenyan partners and told them that the Kenyan situation is less than elegant, and you are asking for their intervention. Yes, you are asking for their intervention because, in our view, we felt that there were very dangerous trends in Kenya. The question of abduction, of abductions, the question of non-police or non-law enforcement entities being empowered covertly, particularly by the political class, to handle matters that looked like police responsibilities. And we said that some of such trends had taken place in places like Haiti, in places like Sudan, particularly in the Sudan question. Mm-hmm. Because the Sudan question, the question of RSF started when the state actors decided to outsource the power to police to non-state actors. Mm. And eventually when these forces then got emboldened, then they decided to formalize them as part of their police infrastructure. The net effect is what we are dealing with in Sudan. So as young people, we asked our partners from outside to make sure that they intervene in the Kenyan situation. We welcome this move so that the best way for Kenya to reassert its position is to make sure that it deals comprehensively with the question of abduction. It makes sure that particularly young people who are not enthusiastic about this administration can speak freely without fear that they can pick from the streets, or they can hear a sudden knock on the door, or that anything else can happen to them. So yes, this is something we welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, and Honorable Mark Nyamita, you have been very consistent with the calls for justice, and this will certainly touch the nerve of the investigation and the investigation process, deaths, injuries, and the arbitrary arrests and abductions of anti-government protesters and voices of dissent. Ideally, then, should this then be a reminder for ourselves to seriously think about the process of justice, whilst it was supposed to have been an intra-communication, this coming from Washington now, which is looking into our books, which appear also somewhat gross indictment on the part of policy players in our country.
I think if you remember, and I think it's in the papers, I think around May, the same senator who's petitioned Congress to review the status of these things did actually speak to his reservations about a comment the president had made that Kenya and China are actually the architects of the new world order. And if you understand it in that context, therefore, world order, who has controlled that particular world order, that actually a new a new world order is actually being created. It is actually the US. So it is actually right that they would be a bit concerned that someone is trying to challenge their dominance over a period of time. And it is important to look at this from that particular perspective, that, we have depended on the US on many other issues, and they have defined how things are actually done. And our association with other partners has constantly been a threat. Prior to, I think, declaration of Kenya as a major non-NATO ally, I think whereas there was efforts from Kenya, there was an equal amount of push from the US because of their own interest, because of the Kenya strategic position in this particular region. So whereas that status is beneficial to us, it is also much more beneficial to the US. So it shouldn't, we shouldn't find ourselves in a space that we are thinking that, okay, if they take away this status, or now Kenya is a bad state, or we are a failed state, or something like that. In any case, we have only held the status for a period of time. In less than, I think, about 2 years now?
1 year.
1 year. It's actually just 1 year. Now, reviews is, that they've called for a review, I think, is also a reminder that what we do internally and externally is also being viewed by other people outside. And I think that, just like my other colleagues are saying, I mean, we all as Kenyans, we have said no to abductions, either allegedly by state or non-state actors, including self-abductions. We have said no to some of those. Incitement of the populace, and how we engage with people from outside. Because this review is not only talking about issues of abductions, it's talking about even international trade. Yeah. Even international trade. And you would see that the biggest part of that petition actually touches on Kenya's relations, including economic relations with China. Economic relations with China. And there's been always a fighting, there's always been a fight between, the US and China in terms of their own economic interest in this particular region. And Kenya is at liberty to pick which partner suits its economic policies for the benefits of her citizens.
Yeah. But is it not concerning, Jarvis, coming to you, because the long list also affects other foreign nationals and the manner in which they were taken, ideally even minus the attention from Washington now, just the status that we have enjoyed otherwise of being a safe haven. For example, the Turkish nationals who were taken reportedly by intelligence officers from Ankara, the disappearance of the Ethiopian national in 2021, the case of Kizza Besigye, the Tanzanian human rights activist. How then can we flip the page of justice here in a manner that also contributes to the country's standing and status amongst the community of nations?
I hope, quite frankly, it would concern anyone that a country would be a place where there would be concerns and fears about potential abduction or repatriation of nationals without clarity. And as a matter of fact, Kenya has continued to be a safe haven and a country that many have beholden for its peace and security. And even foreign nationals have always found quite peace, so much peace and great tranquility here. And that's why reports of the issues to do with, for example, we wouldn't call it abduction, but would say the desired repatriation of Kizza Besigye, for example, with the Turkish nationals, it is something that all of us would want to get to the bottom of it. And of course, as a matter of fact as well, nations, just as human beings relate, nations also relate at their own levels. For example, there would be agreements between, for example, Kenya and the Turkish government about the issue of extradition that could be a matter to do with particular interests on certain individuals. And if there is an agreement to the extent of repatriation, then that agreement is always mooted or midwifed by the Foreign Affairs Ministry between the nations. And it's always honored because of the bilateral interests between two nation states. And so I think, for me, the critical issue would be, what were the fundamental issues that would have necessitated the Turkish nationals, or even, for example, the case of Besigye, and whether it serves the interest of our nations. However, I must also indicate quite clearly that it is important for us as a country, as we have been in the past, to give credence or respect human rights of citizens, rights of nationals that are visiting, because there is no way any person can enter the territory of Kenya without clearance. And so I think to that extent, it's an issue that has attracted so much of condemnation. It's an issue that has also attracted lots of political toing and froing in the discourse. But I think what would be more helpful is to always have clarity of information conveyed by the Department, for example, of or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so that Kenyans are apprised of the circumstances that may have led to a particular national being extradited.
Yeah, and mind you, most of these Turkish nationals were under the United Nations High Commission for Refugee Protection, and of course understanding the context of the politics in Turkey following the fallout between President Tayyip Erdogan and Fethullah Gulen, who is now deceased and was in self-imposed exile in Pennsylvania for a very long time. Kidi, what does this point out then to when an ally now is concerned? Generally though, just for information consumption, this is under a proposed amendment to a bill on the 2026 US military spending, which touches on a raft of array of issues and America's interest across other parts of the world. But ideally then the call for justice, does it speed up in any case and instill that much needed impetus for the families of the affected to get justice?
Ayub, in international human rights law, there is a doctrine called peremptory norms. My brother to my immediate brother to my left is a lawyer. He knows that all states are mandated under the doctrine of non-refoulement to protect people who have run into other jurisdictions from being returned to their countries of origin if they have got apprehension that they could face torture or harm or persecution in any manner. Kenya, as a member of the Community of Nations, I mean, then in my view, fundamentally went against this international customary law that we do not return people to places where they have got legitimate apprehension that they could face persecution. We saw it with Dr. Kizza Besigye, and it was an indictment on our foreign policy when we saw Kizza Besigye looking frail in court because he was being persecuted.
In a military court, to be
in a military court. And we believe he was being, that the charges against Dr. Kizza Besigye were politically motivated. You speak about the Turkish nationals and that they were part of the international refugee body is an even greater indictment on our foreign policy. Not only the foreign policy, but also our law enforcement infrastructure. I mean, the fact that other countries can come to Kenya and pick people in within our jurisdiction is something that I hope our law enforcement, our national security players will have a keen look at.
Yeah, and Honorable Mark Nyamita, regardless of the outcome of this process, which will be in about 180 days' time, when this will be submitted before the Congress after the amendments will take effect. Ideally, America's status today is also one thing somewhat is it. They have elected to the White House a convicted felon, and there is a concern about his commitment to democracy, and for a man who in many aspects has feigned a lot of ignorance on some basic issues. But it's not Donald Trump and America to tell us about the right things, is it, when we have institutions that can take charge of these processes? But how are we getting it so wrong, and why the delays in getting justice for the families who have been affected, including your supporters in the opposition in 2023 during the cost of living demonstrations? But there seems to be an opposition silence completely since 2024 when your party leader went into more or less a political arrangement with the president.
Let me say that it's not that the opposition is silent, that we are not speaking to it. In fact, if you remember recently, I think my party leader did speak to the issue of a review of the 10-point agenda that that was signed, which is the basis of the broad-based government. And one of them is the issues of compensation for victims. And one of the things that we are looking forward to, I think they are setting up a small committee, and I am sure that maybe in the fullness of time, hopefully before end of this year, we will get some traction in terms of which are the families to be compensated, if any. And that investigation has to go on. And I think that this particular government has to move with speed to conclude such cases, because it's not only in this government. The issues of police brutality against its citizens has been with us here for a very, very long time, and it really must be put to an end. People who have died, think about 2007. We have, for example, even members of my community particularly, we lost quite a bit of people. I mean, I speak to people in my constituency are saying they've never buried their loved ones. They actually just went and picked clothing and went and buried. They have never seen. Some buried limbs from 2007. And you remember this matter actually surfaced even at the international front. And there has never been closure around some of those issues. And I think until we gather our internal courage to face these things as they are, because you remember the TJRC report has never been implemented. And it had a lot of, until we are able to confront these issues head on, historically, we will continue to just pile the issues as they're going on. So we do hope that the small team that is actually being constituted between my party and the ruling party as part of this broad-based government is actually going to move with speed, and we want to begin to see convictions. But let me also put something into perspective. Sometimes we assume that all abductions or all killings are actually government-led. That is not the case. And we have seen. You remember there was a case here of a gentleman called Ndiangui, who, the parents were very emotional, and they were said, the DCI went to his house and they picked him, and everyone was actually quite concerned. In fact, they moved to court. I remember they were calling the DCI to actually make a statement, only for the guy to clearly come out and say he's hiding. So we have also criminal elements within the country that are taking advantage of the ongoing vibe that, there are abductions and people are assuming that it is a government that is abducting people. Because every other time that someone has actually been picked, police will issue a statement and say, we are holding Kidi Mwaga, we are holding Javas, or we are holding Mark. Yeah. All others must be treated as criminal elements. When someone is actually lost, we shouldn't assume that, when our loved ones, of course, it is a responsibility of the country, of the government, to ensure the safety and security of every single individual. But I saw, and this I want to challenge, including the media, Ayub, that we have seen, I think in the last 2-3 days, even when we have had victims of people who died on around the time for Sabasaba. And we are assuming that there are victims of government brutality against its citizens. And people are going into those funerals and trying to draw emotions around it, like, all the deaths are actually government. And I don't think that is the case.
Okay. And there are instances where there were clear inconsistencies also in communication from the National Police Service. Yeah. And one that stands out certainly is that of Mwalimu Albert Ojwang, who died in their custody, and the long list of others who are meted with police brutality. When we get back from the break, gentlemen, whilst the review was underway in Washington, the Foreign Affairs CS said some very profound remarks about incumbents in Africa and the chances of re-election. We'll be having the soundbite from the Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi after the break. Stay tuned.